Hi, welcome to my presentation on Chapter 13, the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is abbreviated as PNS, and it can be broadly divided into the sensory division and the motor division. The sensory division is carrying information into the central nervous system, and the motor division is carrying information out of the central nervous system to the body. Both of those divisions have a couple of subdivisions. So the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system is subdivided into the somatic sensory division and the visceral sensory division. The somatic division is everything that you're consciously aware of. So that includes your five senses that you think about having: touch, taste, sight, smell, and hearing. And also it includes your sense of balance and your proprioception. Proprioception is just your awareness of your body's position in space and the amount of tension in your muscles. So when you clench a muscle as hard as you can feel that tension. That is proprioception that you're feeling right there. Then the visceral sensory division is all of the sensory information that you're not consciously aware of. So that's going to include like stretch in all your different organs that can stretch, and some of the chemistry of your blood would be the main things that fall in the visceral sensory division. In general, you're not aware of any information that comes from the visceral sensory division consciously. It is going into your brain. The subconscious parts of your brain are responding to it. But sometimes, if it seems like something's going wrong, then that visceral sensory information can be kind of promoted to your conscious awareness. So, for instance, you have stress receptors all through your gastrointestinal tract that are kind of monitoring, how much stretch you have in your stomach and your intestines. So normally you're not aware of that, but your brain is constantly receiving information about it. It's visceral sensory information. But if you have like gas or something, or you ate too much and you're really full, so there's a lot of stretch in your stomach or your intestines, then you will become aware of that. Then the motor division of the peripheral nervous system also has those same two subdivisions, somatic and visceral. So the somatic motor subdivision is all of the stuff that you are consciously or voluntarily able to control, which is basically your skeletal muscles. So all of the nerves that go to control your skeletal muscles fall into the somatic motor division of the peripheral nervous system. Then you have the visceral motor division, which is also called the autonomic nervous system, and that is all the stuff that you do not consciously control. So that's going to be basically your heart muscle, smooth muscle in organs throughout your body, and your glands that release like hormones or stuff like sweat. So the nerves that control all of those things are part of the visceral motor division, also called the autonomic nervous system. There's also two more subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system, which are the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is abbreviated as the SNS, and it handles fight versus flight. So basically, well, I guess the autonomic nervous system has its own chapter, so we won't get into too many details here, but all of the nerves in your body that would lead to increase in your heart rate or increase in blood pressure, sweating, just any physiological response that is consistent with having a fight or running away. That's all those nerves are a part of the sympathetic nervous system. Then you have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is abbreviated the PNS, which is for rest and digest. So it's kind of the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system. It's going to be active, if you're resting. It promotes digesting your food. It lowers your heart rate, that type of stuff. And before we move on, I'll just note that the abbreviation for the peripheral nervous system and for the parasympathetic nervous system are the same. It's the PNS both times. So you usually kind of need to tell from context clues which one it is. But for me, like on the test, I will write it out as peripheral nervous system or parasympathetic nervous system so that we can avoid confusion about what PNS means. So here's a diagram basically showing what I just talked about or just gone over. So you have the peripheral nervous system divided into the sensory and the motor division. The sensory division is going into the central nervous system. So this is information that's coming from the body, from maybe a sensory cell or a sensory neuron, and it's going into the central nervous system to be processed. Then the central nervous system will kind of decide what to do about that information and make a command and send that command out on the motor division of the peripheral nervous system, which takes information from the central nervous system to the body, specifically to either a muscle or a gland. The sensory division is also called the afferent division here because afferent means going to, as in going to the central nervous system, and the motor division is also called the efferent division because it's coming from. Efferent means coming from. So coming from the central nervous system. But actually I won't use the terms afferent and efferent. I'll just use sensory and motor divisions. Within the sensory division, you have the subdivisions, somatic sensory and visceral sensory. And again, somatic sensory is just all the stuff you're consciously aware of, and the visceral sensory division is all the stuff you are not consciously aware of, mostly coming from your internal organs. Then in the motor division, that's also subdivided into the somatic motor division and the visceral motor division, also called the autonomic nervous system. The somatic motor division is basically controlling your skeletal muscles, which are the ones that you are voluntarily able to control, and the autonomic nervous system controls everything that you are not able to voluntarily control, which would be your smooth muscle, your heart muscle, and glands. And then the autonomic nervous system also has two more subdivisions that aren't quite shown here, but that would be the sympathetic nervous system for fight versus flight and the parasympathetic nervous system for rest and digest, which we will go into more in the next chapter. So you've got two types of nerves that are part of the peripheral nervous system, cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Cranial nerves come out of the brain and spinal nerves come out of the spinal cord. For every I guess every nerve is actually like a pair of nerves because you have one on each side. So for the cranial nerves, you have 12 pairs, which would be like 24 nerves total, but for every one, you have like another copy that's on the other side of the brain. And the same thing for the spinal nerves. They're coming out of the segments of the spinal cord as you go down, one coming out of each side. So you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves that come out of the spinal cord. Similar to how in the brain and spinal cord you have meninges, membranes surrounding them, the nerves also have membranes around them. But we don't call them the meninges though, they have different names. So on the outside of every nerve you have a membrane called the epineurium, which is made of dense irregular connective tissue, and it's actually continuous with the dura mater. So as the nerve emerges from the brain or from the spinal cord, the dura mater is just going to kind of merge with the epineurian membrane around that nerve. Then within that membrane you have the perineurium. So in every nerve you're going to have the axons kind of organized into bundles. Every bundle of axons is called a fascicle, and every fascicle is surrounded by the perineurium membrane, which is also composed of dense irregular connective tissue. Then every single axon in that fascicle is also surrounded by its own membrane called the endoneurium, which is loose connective tissue. And the endoneurium is actually produced by the Schwann cells. So in this diagram of a nerve here, you can see those three membranes. So this outer one here in kind of the darker yellow is the epineurium. Then you can see the fascicles in that nerve. Every bundle of axons here is a fascicle. So the membrane surrounding those fascicles, which is also shown right here, is the perineurium. And then if you look at individual axons, they each have endoneurium around them, which is shown in blue. And that endoneurium is actually made by the Schwann cells. Here you have a picture of an actual nerve, and you can see the epineurium going around the outside of the nerve. Then you can see these kind of pale lines traveling through the nerve. That's actually the perineurium surrounding fascicles, so like that would be one fascicle. And then every individual axon also has endoneurium surrounding it. So now let's cover the spinal nerves. For these, we're not going to focus on the specific functions of each nerve because there's just too many of them. So we'll kind of focus more on their anatomy. So you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves coming out of the spinal cord along its length. For each pair, you have one nerve coming out on the left side of the spinal cord and one coming out on the right side. And the spinal cord is going to be divided into segments based on those nerves and where they're coming out from the spinal cord. As the nerves come out, they're going to thread between vertebrae to leave the spinal column. The segments are all kind of named and numbered, and so you'll have the same name for that segment and for the nerves, the pair of nerves that emerge from that segment, and for the vertebra that are above those nerves where they exit the spinal column. So you have kind of four basic regions of the spinal cord, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral, and each segment in that region is going to be named with the first letter of the region, so C for cervical, T for thoracic, L for lumbar, and S for sacral, and then with a number to indicate which segment it is in that part of the spinal cord. The superior most segment in each portion is always number 1, and the numbers kind of go up from there as you're moving down the cord. So for the cervical spinal cord, you can see that on this diagram here, it's shown in green. You have 8 segments in the cervical spinal cord. So starting with the top, you have C1, so that applies both to the actual segment of the spinal cord and to the nerves that are coming out from it, and to the first vertebrae, or the first vertebra. This is C1 vertebra, and so on down until you get to C8. So that applies also to the segment of the spinal cord and to these C8 nerves that are coming out of that segment and to the vertebra that is directly above them. And then for the thoracic spinal cord, you have 12 segments of that. So it starts from T1 and goes down to T12. Actually, I think on this diagram, they've kind of miscolored the last segment there. It should be red like the other thoracic segments, not purple. After that, you get into the lumbar region, and you have 5 lumbar segments, so L1 through L5, and then finally you have the sacral region and 5 sacral segments, so S1 through S5. At the very end of the spinal cord, you actually have one more pair of spinal nerves, which are the coccygeal nerves, and we call them CO1, CO for coccygeal. Coccygeal just means related to the tailbone. So if you're looking at this diagram, you kind of notice that in the lower parts of it, or in the inferior parts, you just have the nerves. The spinal cord is shown in yellow, and it actually stops at about the L1 level of the spinal column. And then you just have nerves traveling down. So the reason why that happens is that as a baby is kind of growing, the spinal column, the actual bones there, the vertebrae, are getting bigger faster than the spinal cord gets bigger. So they start out kind of mashed up with each other, and as the baby grows, the spinal cord ends up ending up maybe shrunken back into the spinal column a bit, so that it actually stops at L1, and then after that you just have nerves running through your spinal column. And this kind of splay of nerves down here is actually called the cauda equina, which means the horse's tail, just because of the way that it looks. So that means that for the latter portions of the spinal cord, the actual spinal cord segments are going to be located superior to the vertebrae that they correspond with and where the nerves actually emerge. So the S5 segment, the last sacral segment, would be located right here at the very tip of the spinal cord. The spinal nerves, the S5 spinal nerves, are going to come out there and then travel down in the spinal column until they get to the S5 vertebrae, and they will emerge at that point. So this slide is just kind of showing how the spinal column changes throughout development as compared to the spinal cord. So you can see when you're still a fetus, at about 8 weeks of development, your spinal cord is the same length as your spinal column. And if you look at the S1 segment, that segment is right there on the spinal cord. Then you have your S1 nerves coming out, and they exit at the S1 vertebrae, which is right there next to that spinal cord segment. As the fetus continues to develop, though, the spinal column starts to get longer faster than the spinal cord does. So these nerves end up having to travel down from where they actually emerged from the spinal cord to get to the vertebrae that they are traveling between. So at this point, the sacral, the S1 segment would be located right here. Then you have your S1 nerves emerging from it, and they're going to travel downwards through the spinal column to come out just below the S1 vertebrae. And that trend just kind of continues. When you're born, your spinal column has gotten even larger compared to your spinal cord, so those nerves need to travel even further down. And by the time you're an adult, the situation has progressed even more, so that your spinal cord actually ends at about the L1 level, and all of your sacral nerves need to travel down through the cauda equina to get to their appropriate vertebral segments to exit between. So if you were to zoom in on one particular spinal nerve, you would see that it has two roots. So here you have a segment of the spinal cord, and here you have one nerve coming off of it. Of course, there would be another nerve coming off the other side to complete the pair. But if we just look at this particular nerve, you'll see that you have one root coming off the anterior surface of the spinal cord and another root coming off the posterior surface of the spinal cord. And they're both going to merge together to form the actual spinal nerve. And the same thing would be happening on the other side. So the anterior root is carrying only motor information, and the posterior root is carrying only sensory information, which means that on the anterior root, that's where you have like cells that have their cell bodies in the actual spinal cord, and their axons are traveling down that anterior root into the spinal nerve, and they're going to ultimately go to either a muscle or a gland. In the posterior root, you have cells that have their cell bodies somewhere else, not in the spinal cord, and they're sending their axons into the spinal cord along the posterior root. And those axons would be carrying sensory information from some part of the body. Actually, on the posterior root, you also have this enlargement here, which is called the posterior root ganglion. A ganglion is just kind of like a ball of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. And here, so of course, since it's a ganglion, you have cell bodies, and these are going to be the cell bodies for sensory neurons. So all the sensory neurons whose axons are traveling along the posterior root, their cell bodies will actually be right here in the posterior root ganglion. And they have these kind of weird axons, and we're going to go over this later on in a bit more detail, but their axons are actually going to kind of split right here, and one branch will go off down the spinal nerve to some sensory receptor. The other branch will go along the posterior root into the spinal cord. After the two roots come together to form the actual spinal nerve, it's going to split again. That is actually not shown in this diagram. It's shown in another, like the next slide's diagram. But once you form the spinal nerve, it's going to split into two branches. One branch is the anterior ramus, and the other branch is the posterior ramus. So together they are rami. Rami is the plural, and ramus is a singular. And ramus is just Latin for branch, so literally it just means like the front branch and the back branch. The two rami, the anterior and posterior rami, are mixed branches, so they're going to be carrying both sensory and motor information, and the anterior branch will be carrying that towards the anterior part of the body. The posterior branch will carry it to the posterior part of the body. But of course, the spinal cord is already kind of on the posterior surface of your body, so there's not much back there, just basically, your back. So the posterior ramus is pretty small, and it actually isn't going to carry visceral motor information. So you don't have any autonomic nerves that travel or autonomic axons that travel along the posterior ramus. They all go on the anterior ramus because the autonomic nervous system is always controlling like your visceral organs, and those are all located in front of the spinal cord. So here in this diagram, you can see kind of a more complete picture of the spinal nerves. So this is a pair of spinal nerves, one coming out of each side of the spinal cord, and for each one you can see the two roots. You can always recognize the posterior root because it has the ball on it, the ganglion, the posterior root ganglion. So the anterior root is the one that doesn't have that bulge. That is carrying only motor axons. Then the posterior root is the one that does have the bulge. It's carrying only sensory axons, and the bulge itself is the posterior root ganglion, which has sensory cell bodies. Then those two roots are going to merge together to form the spinal nerve. But as you can see, like basically right away, you have the spinal nerve branching again into the posterior ramus and the anterior ramus. And you can see the anterior ramus is very thick. The posterior ramus is much skinnier. That's because it doesn't have as many axons, because it's only going to your back. And it's basically already at the back because this is your spinal column. So it doesn't need to carry very much information. Just basically it needs to have motor axons that control your back muscles and somatosensory axons so that you can feel touch on your back. The posterior and anterior rami are both mixed, so they're carrying both motor and sensory information. The posterior ramus is not carrying visceral motor information, though. It doesn't have any autonomic nervous system axons traveling along it. So the autonomic nervous system, any axons in here from the autonomic nervous system are exclusively traveling in the anterior ramus. Pretty quickly after the spinal nerve splits into the anterior and posterior rami, you have another ramus coming off of the spinal nerve, which we call the ramus communicans. That ramus is going to travel to another little bulge. That bulge is called the sympathetic chain ganglion. So this ramus communicans is only carrying autonomic motor information, and specifically it's only for the sympathetic nervous system. So any autonomic nervous system axons that you have in here, if they're for the sympathetic nervous system, they're going to travel down the ramus communicans to the sympathetic chain ganglion. And in the sympathetic chain ganglion, you have cell bodies for the sympathetic nervous system, but we're not going to worry about that very much because, of course, it has its own chapter later on. And on the other side, you can see the same stuff. So you have the anterior root, the posterior root ganglion, the spinal nerve, where those two roots merge together. Then basically right away, the spinal nerve branches into the posterior ramus and the anterior ramus. And then very soon, you also have the ramus communicans coming off of the anterior ramus and carrying autonomic axons. So this diagram is just showing the relationship between the cervical nerves and the roots of the spinal accessory nerve that come out of the cervical spinal cord. So you can see a basic summary diagram right here. This is your spinal cord. Then where it widens, it kind of just changes into the medulla oblongata. So up here, this is not the spinal cord anymore. This is the medulla oblongata, the very base of the brainstem. And you can see your cervical spinal nerves coming off of the cervical spinal cord, C1 through C5, and of course it would continue going down to C8. Then you also have these other smaller things coming off of the spinal cord, which are actually axons that are traveling up to join with the spinal accessory nerve. And right here you have the roots of the spinal accessory nerve that are actually in the brainstem. So these two lines are going to merge together to finally form the spinal accessory nerve. This is just a more detailed diagram showing basically the same thing. So you can see the cervical nerves here in more detail. You have the two roots drawn out. You can tell that this one in the back must be the posterior root because it's the one that has the bulge. The one in the front then is the anterior root. Those roots merge together to form the actual spinal nerve, and then you see branching right away. So this little branch coming off of here is the posterior ramus. The anterior ramus continues on, and then it branches again where the ramus communicans comes off of the anterior ramus. You can also see that some of these nerves are merging together. They do that. When you have nerves merging together like this and then branching again and merging together again, that's called a plexus. You can actually see some of that here. So you have all these cervical nerves, kind of some of their branches will merge together and then some of them branch again to travel, to ultimately to their targets. And then also you can see the spinal accessory nerve traveling up here. So it has roots marked in red here. And all those roots coming off of the cervical spinal cord are traveling up to join with the roots that come out of the medulla oblongata itself. And then you can see them merging here, and then more branching and merging later on. It's just, basically limitless amounts of merging and branching that go on with these nerves after they're out of the spinal cord. And then I guess I'll add that at the very top here, these are additional cranial nerves that are coming out of the brainstem. Let's see, this one right here is actually the vagus nerve. So as I had mentioned, where you have those nerves kind of branching, merging together, branching again, merging again in different patterns to form a really complicated looking network, that is called a plexus. And we have actually a number of plexuses formed by the spinal nerves. There's 4 main ones that we'll kind of focus on, but there are others in addition to those 4. When you have the nerves forming a plexus like that, every single branch has its own name, and luckily we're not going to learn them because it's very, very, very many names. But just know they are all named individually. Each little part of the plexus has a name. So when the nerves are going into the plexus, they are just anterior rami from a spinal nerve. Sometimes you can actually have cranial nerves feeding into those plexuses as well. And then you have all the complicated branching and merging and more branching and more merging. And then on the other side of that, you're going to have other nerves coming out that have their own names and are kind of a mix of axons that originally came out of the spinal cord in different places. And sometimes they'll include axons that actually came out of the brainstem on a cranial nerve as well. And then each one of those nerves will kind of have a particular part of the body that it goes to. So the posterior rami for the spinal nerves do not participate in plexuses, just because the information they're carrying is pretty simple. It doesn't have to go far, just to the back. So it would just be the anterior rami that participate in the nerve plexuses, and sometimes cranial nerves as well. And the exception to that would be most of the thoracic anterior rami do not form a plexus. T1, the T1 anterior ramus does participate in a plexus, but the rest, the T2 through T12, do not participate in a plexus. But all the rest of the anterior rami of the spinal nerves do participate in at least one plexus. So the first spinal nerve plexus we'll learn specifically is the cervical plexus, which contains axons that are coming from the cervical spinal nerves C1 through C5, and also from some cranial nerves, specifically cranial nerves 11 and 12, which are the spinal accessory nerve and the hypoglossal nerve. So the cervical plexus is basically supplying your kind of upper torso and your neck and part of your head. It's controlling muscles there. It's also carrying your sense of touch or somatosensation. And you also have one nerve that comes out of the cervical plexus in particular, which is the phrenic nerve. That is going to travel down into the thoracic cavity, and it ends up controlling the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the primary muscle that provides force for you to breathe. So there's actually several muscles that help you breathe, but under normal circumstances, the diaphragm is providing almost all of the force for that. And then even if you're trying to do like forceful breathing and you're using extra muscles, even so, the diaphragm is still providing the bulk of the force. So if you have something happen to your phrenic nerve, that means that you would no longer be able to contract your diaphragm, and that means that you would no longer be able to breathe sufficiently to provide yourself with enough oxygen to survive. So the phrenic nerve is very important for that reason, and that's basically why we are learning the name of it. You can see the cervical plexus diagrammed right here. In blue, you have the spinal nerves that contribute to it, so C1, 2, 3, 4 through C5. And then in gray here, you have the cranial nerves, which would be the spinal accessory nerve and the hypoglossal nerve that contribute to that plexus as well. And you can see the complicated pattern of branching and merging and more branching that goes on in this plexus. So again, every single one of these branches has a name. But we're not worrying about them. The only one that we care about is the phrenic nerve, which is actually this right here. So this nerve right here is the phrenic nerve that's going to descend to the diaphragm and control the diaphragm. So then you also have the brachial plexus a little further down the spinal column. The brachial plexus contains axons that are from the cervical spinal nerves C5 through C8, and it also has axons from the first thoracic spinal nerve, or T1. So that one is diagrammed right here. So you have C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1 all contributing to this plexus. And again, you can see the complicated pattern of branching and merging, and again, each branch has its own name. But all of the axons that are traveling in the brachial plexus ultimately are going into the arms. So they're going to be providing sensory and motor information for the arms. So that includes basically, controlling your skeletal muscles in the arms, also touch information from the arms, and proprioception. So again, touch, the fancy name for that is somatosensation, and proprioception is just your sense of where, in this case, where your arm is in space and how much tension you have in your arm muscles. Then you have the lumbar plexus, which has axons that are coming from the lumbar spinal nerves 1 through 4. This is going into the legs, and it's basically providing like the same thing for the legs as the brachial plexus provides for the arms. So it's providing like control of the skeletal muscles in your legs, and also touch or somatosensation and proprioception for your legs, as well as your pelvis area. It actually doesn't serve the entirety of your leg. It only serves part of it. Specifically, it's the anterior part, the medial part, and the proximal part. So on this diagram here, you can kind of see which parts of the leg are served by the lumbar plexus, and it's actually going to be the anterior, medial, proximal part. So basically the front of the leg, also the inner part of the leg here, but only the proximal half of the leg, so basically from the knee up, or your thighs basically, but actually not the outer portion of your thighs. If you look at the outer portion, that is supplied not by the cervical plexus, not by the lumbar plexus. Instead, that part of your leg is actually supplied by the sacral plexus, which is the last spinal nerve plexus we'll learn. The sacral plexus has axons that are coming from lumbar spinal nerves 4 and 5, and then the first 4 sacral spinal nerves. So it's very similar, also providing control of the skeletal muscles in your legs, also carrying touch information and proprioception, but it's just serving the rest of the leg basically that's not served by the lumbar plexus. So it's serving the posterior part, the posterior part, so the back of your leg, also the distal part, so your lower leg, and basically anything that's not served by the lumbar plexus. So also this kind of outer part of your thigh, or I should say this lateral part of your thigh. The sacral plexus has another kind of famous nerve emerging from it, which is the sciatic nerve, which some of you may have heard of because I guess it's kind of frequently a source of pain for people as they age, but it's actually the largest nerve in your whole body, and it goes from your sacrum, which is part of your pelvis, all the way to the end of your leg. In the diagrams here, you can see representations of the lumbar and sacral plexuses. So the lumbar plexus is on the top, and the sacral plexus is on the bottom. So all these sacral nerves that are contributing to the sacral plexus are actually coming out of the spinal column at the sacrum. This kind of large fused bone is the sacrum. It's kind of part of your pelvis, but it's also made out of fused vertebrae. So yeah, there's your sacral nerves that are contributing to that plexus, and then your L4 and L5. So now that we've covered the anatomy of the spinal nerves, and we've covered basically the cranial nerves, we're going to get into basically more about the information that they carry, starting with sensation, and then we'll do motor information after sensation. So in the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system, you have a lot of stuff. Of course, you have your two subdivisions, the somatic sensory division and the visceral sensory division. And then within those subdivisions, you have plenty. So for the somatic sensory division, that's where you have most of your different, I guess, senses. First, you have somatosensation, which is just your sense of touch. And that may seem like one thing to you, but there's actually multiple receptors that are involved in your sense of touch and kind of multiple aspects of your sense of touch. So first you have mechanoreception, which is just like physically sensing like pressure and touching things. But then you also have thermoreception, which is sensing temperature, and you have nociception, which is sensing pain. So mechanoreception, thermoreception, and nociception are all a part of your sense of touch, or somatosensation. For mechanoreception, you have multiple different cell types that are involved in different aspects of sensing like touch and pressure, which we kind of went over briefly when we talked about the skin, but they are the Merkel cells, Meissner corpuscles, the Pacinian corpuscles, the Ruffinian corpuscles, and then also actually hair follicle receptors. So, if you just kind of brush your hand along your skin, just above your skin, though, so you're not actually touching it, you can actually feel something, which is, that's of course you brushing your hairs on your skin. You can feel that because of those hair follicle receptors. They're able to sense when the hairs move. So those 5 things are all combining to form your mechanoreception, or your ability to sense physical touches. Then you also have thermoreception, so you have some nerve endings in your skin that have ion channels that are sensitive to different temperature ranges, and they'll open under certain, if the temperature is right for that ion channel. So that's thermoreception that allows you to sense warm and cold things. Then you have nociception, which is the fancy word for pain. So nociception includes extreme mechanoreception and extreme thermoreception. So that means for extreme mechanoreception, if you just touch something, that's just mechanoreception. But if you like hit your arm against something really hard, that is again that's just pressure, but it's very extreme pressure, so that's going to be picked up by a nociceptor, and you will experience it more as pain rather than just a touch. Same thing for extreme thermoreception. If you touch a surface that's really hot or really cold, it's not going to be a normal thermoreceptor that responds to that. It's going to be a nociceptor that is able to sense temperatures in that extreme range, and you're going to feel that not just as a temperature, but as pain. And then finally, you also have some chemoreception in your skin that's part of nociception. So you have, for instance, sensors in your skin or receptors in your skin that can respond to chemicals like capsaicin or to extreme pH levels. So if you have like a hot pepper on your skin and it burns you, that's actually a chemoreceptor that's responding to the capsaicin, and that's part of your nociception. Same thing if you're like burned by an acid. That's a chemoreceptor that's picking up the low pH level and causing you to feel pain in response. Then in addition to somatosensation, you also have proprioception. There's 2 parts of proprioception. First, you can sense the position of your joints. So within your joints, you have mechanoreceptors that are able to basically sense how much stretch is in different parts of the joint, and the amount of stretch in the different parts of the joint is related to the position of the joint. Then you also have, as the second part of proprioception, you also have the ability to sense how much tension is in your muscles. So when you contract your muscles, you can feel that tension, and that's part of your proprioception. You have kind of two contributors to your ability to sense tension in your muscles. First, you have you have a special type of muscle fiber. Most of the fibers in your muscle are, providing force in contraction, and they're actually contracting your muscle. But a few of them are not providing contraction. Instead, they're just sensing the contraction. So those special muscle fibers, the axons that supply them, are actually traveling with somatic motor nerves. They're not traveling with sensory nerves, just because they're going to the muscle. And then you also have the Golgi tendon organs, which are located in the tendons that connect your muscles to bones. So when you contract your muscles, that's going to tug on the tendon and tug on the bone. It's going to end up putting a lot of stress on the tendon, and that can be picked up by the Golgi tendon organs. So between those special muscle fibers and the Golgi tendon organs that are sensing strain on your tendons, you're able to get an idea of how much tension is in your muscles. And then with the mechanoreceptors that you have in your joints, you can sense the position of your joints. So if you just close your eyes and hold your arms out, you can actually feel where they are in space. You don't have to look at them to feel. And that's your proprioception. Then finally, you have your special senses, which are the ones that you usually kind of think about for the most part. So you have, of course, vision, audition, which is the fancy word for hearing, olfaction, which is the fancy word for smell, gustation, which is the fancy word for taste, and vestibulation, which is the fancy word for balance. Those are all considered special senses because you have very specialized structures that you use to pick those things up. So that's all in the somatic sensory division. So there's a lot of stuff that you can sense consciously in the somatic sensory division. Then you also have the visceral sensory division, which you can also refer to as viscerosensation. And there's three basic parts of that, so it's a lot simpler. So you have mechanoreception, which basically just means you're able to sense stretch in your internal organs. Of course, you're not consciously aware of that usually. Then you have chemoreception, prominently for your blood, so you're able to sense certain aspects of the chemistry of your blood. I already mentioned sensing the oxygen concentration in your blood, sensing the carbon dioxide concentration in your blood. You can also sense the pH of your blood. Some other things you can sense as well that are like chemicals. But yeah, your ability to sense different chemicals in your body is chemoreception. You're not really aware of that though, so that's part of viscerosensation. And then finally, nociception. So normally you would not feel any part of viscerosensation, but if you do end up with an extreme level of stretch in one of your organs, that will be picked up by a nociceptor, and you will actually you may actually feel that. I shouldn't say that you will feel it for sure, but you have a better chance to actually feel it. So if we look at the neurons that are actually responding to the sensory information, their cell bodies are going to be located in the posterior root ganglion. They are called sensory neurons, which technically means, or should mean at least, that they are picking up sensory information, and they're sending it to another neuron. So most neurons are connected to other neurons on both sides, right? They receive messages from other neurons, they send those messages to other neurons. For sensory neurons, if they're proper sensory neurons, then they're not receiving messages from a neuron. They're actually receiving sensory information from the body or from the external environment, and then they're sending that information to a neuron. So for these sensory neurons, their cell bodies are found in the posterior root ganglion, and they actually are kind of weird because they don't really have dendrites. Instead, they have an axon that leaves the cell body and then branches. And one branch travels up the posterior root into the spinal cord. The other branch is traveling down the spinal nerve to, whatever location. Maybe it's ending in the wall of your stomach, if this is the visceral sensory neuron. Maybe it's ending in your skin, if it's a somatic sensory neuron. It's going to terminate wherever it's trying to pick information up from. So at the end of this axon, it's going to branch, and at the end of all these branches, you have sensory receptors. So that probably just means for most of these sensory neurons that you have ion channels that are maybe mechanically gated, so that when you kind of push on them or when they get stretched, the channels will open and you start having action potentials. But for other sensory neurons, they might have other ion channels that are gated in a different way, and some of them will even have kind of specialized structures around them to help them sense a particular aspect of some sensation. So for your somatosensory neurons, like the Meissner corpuscles and the ruthenian corpuscles and the Pacinian corpuscles, those corpuscles are all little structures that are located around these sensory receptors and help them respond to different aspects of touch and pressure. But whatever type of sensory receptor you have here, it's going to be able to respond to a specific type of sensory information, and when it responds, you're going to have action potentials triggered. You actually don't have local potentials happening because this is an axon, so you're going to go straight to action potentials. Those action potentials are going to travel up the axon into the posterior root. They're actually going to just go straight past that cell body and go down the other branch of the axon into the spinal cord. Once this neuron gets into the spinal cord, its axon is going to terminate at a synapse with another neuron whose cell body would actually be located inside the gray matter of the spinal cord. This other neuron that the information is getting sent to might be a neuron that is sending that information further up the spinal cord into the brain, or it might be a neuron that's called well, technically they would both be classed as interneurons, but it might be like a spinal cord interneuron that's just kind of staying right here and making a short little hop to maybe a motor neuron. And then if it synapses onto a motor neuron, that motor neuron would be coming out along this anterior root, and that would be, innervating some muscle. So that would be basically a simple reflex arc. So for instance, if this sensory neuron is for nociception, and it is going to respond if you touch a very hot surface, then you touch maybe the burner on a stove. So now you're going to have action potentials traveling along this axon into the spinal cord. That information will end up going up into the brain, but you're also going to have a little spinal cord interneuron, so the information is going to get passed to the spinal cord interneuron, which is going to carry over and contact a motor neuron that is actually going to go travel down this anterior root and connect to a muscle in your arm, and it's going to tell that motor neuron to tell the muscle to yank your arm back for a reflex. So we have a lot of different ways to classify different sensory neurons. There's kind of different characteristics that they can have. So first, we could classify sensory neurons as being either interoceptive or exteroceptive. If it's interoceptive, then that means it's picking up some information about your internal body or the environment inside your body. If it's exteroceptive, then it's picking up information about the outside world. So in general, your somatic senses that you're actually, consciously aware of are exteroceptive. They're picking up information about the world around you. And your visceral senses are interoceptive, and they're picking up information about the internal state of your body. The only exception to that is proprioception, so that is a somatic sense that is picking up information about the state of your body, which would be, the position of your joints and the tension in your muscles. Apart from that, your somatic senses are exteroceptive. You can also have sensory neurons that are either rapidly adapting or slowly adapting. If it's rapidly adapting, that means that when you have the sensory stimulus start, the neuron is going to respond. But if the sensory stimulus continues, the neuron is going to stop responding and it's just going to go quiet again. If it's slowly adapting, then the sensory stimulus starts, the neuron responds, and if the sensory stimulus continues, then the neuron will continue to respond. So all of your senses actually have a mix of both types of sensory neurons in them. Some neurons that respond to a stimulus but then stop if the stimulus continues, and other neurons that are slowly adapting that respond to a stimulus and will continue to respond if the stimulus continues. different senses will have like a different mix of the two types. Um, and I guess a good example of like rapidly adapting senses would be like just your sense of touch itself. So you know, when you're getting dressed in the morning and you put on your shirt, you can feel the shirt going onto your body. So you have the sensory stimulus, which is your shirt going onto your body, and you have sensory neurons that are responding to that. Some of them are rapidly adapting and some of them are slowly adapting. So all of them are going to respond at first, and that's why you get this big feeling of your shirt going onto your body. But then as you go about your day and you keep wearing your shirt, all the rapidly adapting sensory neurons are going to stop responding to it. So you still have the stimulus present of the shirt, but your neurons, your rapidly adapting neurons, are no longer reacting to it. So they're not sending action potentials into the spinal cord about the shirt anymore. And that's why you kind of become less and less aware of your shirt on your body as the day goes by. But you know, if you kind of stop and think about it, like, can I feel my shirt? Well, you can, and that's because you have some slowly adapting neurons that are still responding to the shirt. Sensory neurons can also have free nerve endings, or they can have encapsulated nerve endings. If the sensory neuron has a free nerve ending, that just means that the axon kind of stops. It just branches and then it stops. And you're going to have some ion channels in there that are maybe mechanically gated, or maybe they're gated by temperature. Or maybe they're gated in response to a particular chemical, like hydrogen ions, if they're sensing pH. So you just have like a free nerve ending with no other structures around it, and then ion channels in it that will start an action potential. Then in an encapsulated nerve ending, you actually have a little structure around the nerve ending. So as I had mentioned, like your Meissner corpuscles, your Pacinian corpuscles, those are little structures around the nerve endings for some of your sensory neurons that help them kind of sense particular aspects of touch. So that applies to those aspects of somatosensation, like mechanoreception, and it also applies to your special senses. So your eyes, your ears, these are specialized structures that are modifying sound waves and light waves to allow you to pick them up. You can also classify sensory neurons based on how quickly they conduct action potentials along their axons, which is going to depend on whether or not their axons are myelinated, which most of them are, of course, but some aren't. And it also depends on the diameter of the axon. The bigger the diameter, the faster the action potentials will travel. And we actually have like different classes of sensory neuron axons that have like specific names and specific conduction speeds, but we're not going to worry about them in here. Then finally, you have receptive fields for every sensory neuron. So every sensory neuron has a receptive field. The receptive field is the area of the body or sensory space where stimuli are going to be picked up by that particular neuron's sensory receptors. So if you have a sensory neuron traveling to your skin, and it's going to be for your somatosensation, when the axon gets to your skin, it's going to branch, and those branches will cover a small patch of your skin. That patch of skin where you have the branches for that axon, that's the receptive field for that particular neuron. If you touch your skin in that patch, the feeling is going to be picked up by the axons by the axon branches of that particular sensory neuron, and it will be that specific neuron that responds. If you touch not on that patch, but like kind of just next to it, it'll actually be a different sensory neuron's receptors that are responding. You'll be in the receptive field for a different sensory neuron. So every sensory neuron has a receptive field. Some of them are smaller, some of them are bigger. So if you have a sensory neuron that only has a few branches on its axon, that's probably going to mean that the ends of its axon are kind of clustered together really tightly, and it's going to have a small sensory field, small receptive field. If you have a sensory neuron that has a lot of branches on its axon and they're covering a wider area in your skin or wherever else in your body, that's going to be a larger receptive field. Whenever you have neurons that have smaller receptive fields, that means you're more sensitive in that area. If you have neurons that have larger receptive fields, then you're less sensitive in that area. Basically, if you're trying to cover, let's say you're trying to cover the palm of your hand with receptive fields for different neurons. So you need every part of your palm to be served by at least one sensory neuron, so that when you touch there, the sensation will be picked up by a neuron. If you're going to use like 100 different sensory neurons to supply your hand, they're each going to have small sensory or small receptive fields. On the other hand, if you were to use just maybe just 5 sensory neurons to supply your entire palm, each one of them is going to have a very large receptive field. It'll actually be 1/5 the size of your whole palm. So then if you touch, in 1/5 1/5 of your palm, maybe right below your pinky finger, that sensation is going to be picked up by one of those sensory neurons. Then maybe if you touch right next to it, or right underneath your ring finger, that's probably going to be picked up by the same sensory neuron, which means that you're actually not going to tell the difference between those two touches. It's the same neuron that's responding. All your brain knows is this particular neuron is responding. So it's going to feel a touch in whatever area the receptive field for that neuron covers, which is going to be like a large part of your hand. On the other hand, if you had like 100 neurons there, with 100 different receptive fields on the palm of your hand, each one is going to be very small. So if you touch right below your pinky finger, that'll be in the receptive field for one sensory neuron. One neuron will pick that up. Then if you move your touch to below your ring finger, it's going to be picked up by a different sensory neuron using a different receptive field. And you're going to feel it as a different touch because a different neuron is responding to it. So that's kind of the reason why when you have more neurons with smaller receptive fields, you get a more sensitive part of your body. And if you have less neurons with bigger receptive fields, then you get a less sensitive part of your body. If you have a lot of sensory neurons with small receptive fields serving a particular part of your body, like for instance your hands, you're going to need to devote a lot of real estate to those neurons in your brain. So in your brain, there's a particular part of your brain that is processing touch information, right in the parietal lobe. So you have your primary somatosensory cortex in the very front of the parietal lobe. And all of the sensory neurons that are picking up somatosensation or touch information from all over your body are ultimately sending that information to the primary somatosensory cortex. And that's kind of shown right here. This strip of cortex in blue is the primary somatosensory cortex. So it's actually going to be divided up by body part. If you have one body part that only has a few neurons serving it, that's going to end up not getting very much space on here because there's not a lot of neurons coming from there. If you have one body part that has a lot of sensory neurons with really small receptive fields, you're going to need to devote a lot of space to it on here because you just have a lot of neurons coming from there. So for example, trunk here, this is basically the entire torso of your body. Whereas fingers here are getting a lot more space, even though they're much smaller physically, but that's because the sensory neurons that serve them have really small receptive fields, whereas the sensory neurons that serve your abdomen or your torso have pretty large receptive fields. If you were to draw a homunculus or an image of a person whose body parts are proportioned similar to how space is devoted to them in your cortex, you would get something that looks like this. You get a guy with gigantic hands and a gigantic mouth, basically. So these are the two parts of your body where you have really, really large numbers of neurons serving them, and those neurons have really, really small receptive fields. If you go to look at your chest or your back, you have very few neurons serving those areas comparatively, and their receptive fields are very large. So they end up having a small amount of real estate inside your brain. So for every sensory neuron, at the end of its axon where it's trying to pick up sensory stimuli, it's going to be doing a process called sensory transduction. Sensory transduction means that the sensory neuron is taking a stimulus and converting it into basically action potentials or some type of change in the membrane potential. In sensory transduction, a sensory neuron is going to use some type of ion channel to create a membrane potential change in response to a sensory stimulus. If you have a sensory neuron that just has free nerve endings, then it'll just be literally that ion channel that is doing the sensory transduction and converting the sensory stimulus to a membrane potential change. But for some sensory neurons, they have specialized structures around them. So the ones that have encapsulated nerve endings are going to have, some specialized structure that is helping them do the sensory transduction process. So ultimately, in sensory transduction, you're trying to start an action potential. But technically speaking, since the first ion channel that opens is not going to be a voltage-gated channel, then technically the first membrane potential change is not going to be an action potential. It's going to be something called a receptor potential. So you're going to have some type of sensory stimulus, open some ion channels in the nerve endings of a sensory neuron. And then ions will flow through that channel, and that causes a receptor potential, and then the receptor potential will trigger an action potential if it's strong enough to take the membrane to threshold. Usually a receptor potential is going to be depolarizing, so it would take the membrane potential closer to threshold. Occasionally they might be hyperpolarizing though. It just depends on the particular neuron that we're talking about. Most of the ion channels that are involved in sensory transduction are called TRP channels. TRP stands for transient receptor potential. Some of them are different types of channels, but most of them are TRP channels. There's different types of ways that TRP channels can be gated. Some of them are mechanically gated, some of them are temperature gated, some of them are pH gated, or gated by another chemical. So for the mechanically gated channels, they will open anytime the cell membrane stretches enough to open them. For the temperature gated channels, they will open at a specific range of temperatures. So you have all different types of temperature gated channels that will respond to different temperature ranges. Then for the pH gated channels, those are of course going to respond at certain pH levels. pH is a measure of how many protons you have in the solution, so it just depends on the proton concentration. A lot of the TRP channels can be activated by multiple different stimuli, and a number of them can be activated by chemicals like capsaicin or cannabinoids or menthol. So just to take an example, one particular TRP channel is called TRPV1. That will open at temperatures that are over 41 degrees Celsius, which is 106 degrees Fahrenheit, so pretty hot. It will also open at a pH between 4.5 and 5, which is weakly acidic. As a reference, lemons are about a pH of 2, so pH 4.5 to 5 is not that acidic. And the TRPV1 channel will also open if you have a chemical like capsaicin or cannabinoids bind to it. So whenever that TRPV1 channel opens, you're going to get ions flowing through it, and it's going to be depolarizing, so you're going to have a depolarizing receptor potential. If that depolarizing receptive potential is strong enough to take the membrane potential from -70 millivolts at rest to -55 millivolts, then you're going to have voltage-gated sodium channels right there, also in the nerve endings that are going to open, and then you have an action potential firing. So here's kind of a diagram showing that process. Here we're looking at a particular sensory neuron, or I guess I should say the nerve endings for a particular sensory neuron in the finger. This is a free nerve ending, so you don't have any specialized structures around it. And if you zoom in on that nerve ending, you can see that you have some different ion channels here. This one is a voltage-gated sodium channel, and these two are mechanically gated sodium channels. And at rest, they are all closed. Then if you touch the person's fingertip and put pressure on it, then you're going to ultimately put pressure on the membrane of this neuron, and you're going to end up deforming the membrane a bit, and you don't have to deform it very much before these mechanically gated channels will pop open. So now that they're open, you have sodium entering the cell, and that causes a receptor potential. It's a depolarizing receptor potential. Once the receptor potential raises the membrane potential up to negative 55 millivolts, then your voltage-gated sodium channel is going to open. And then you have sodium rushing into the cell, and you have an action potential beginning. That action potential would then travel down the axon into the spinal cord ultimately. So that is one example of how sensory transduction can work in a free nerve ending with mechanically gated channels. The exact process will be slightly different if you have different ion channels, or it might be significantly different if you have specialized structures around the nerve endings that are kind of modifying the sensory stimulus somehow. But that's the basic process. So we'll look in a little more detail at proprioception. You are able to sense your joint position in proprioception and the amount of contraction in your muscles. In order to sense the joint position, you have nerve endings in your joint capsule. So every joint is surrounded by kind of like a membrane of connective tissue that is kind of holding everything together in there, and that's called the joint capsule. So you have these different nerve endings embedded in the joint capsule. So you can see some of them here in blue, some other ones in red, and some other ones in green. Some of these are free nerve endings. Some of them have little specialized structures around them actually, so some of them are encapsulated, similar to Ruffinian or Pacinian corpuscles in the skin. But they're basically all working roughly the same way. So if your joint is bent, maybe the way that this one is, it's kind of bent maybe to the left. So that means that on the left side of the joint capsule, you're going to have a greater level of stretch. On the right side, you're going to have less stretch. So as these nerve endings on the right side are kind of relaxing and stopping firing, the ones on the left side are stretching, their mechanically gated channels are opening, and they're starting to fire action potentials. And based on that, your brain can interpret the position of this joint. Then to sense muscle contraction, you have a couple of different structures that allow you to do that. You have those specialized muscle fibers that are actually called muscle spindles, technically speaking, and then you have Golgi tendon organs. So the Golgi tendon organs are the simplest ones. They're located in your tendons. Tendons attach muscles to bones. So anytime the muscle contracts, this tendon is going to be under pressure, or it's going to be stretched out. And you have this nerve ending coming in here. Well, you have the sensory neuron sending its axon in here, and the nerve endings are going to be contacting different fibers inside the tendon, different collagen fibers in the tendon. As the tendon stretches, because the muscle is contracting, you're going to end up stretching these nerve endings, and you have mechanically gated channels in them that will then open, and then you'll have a receptor potential, and then action potentials will travel down the axon. Then in the muscles themselves, you have muscle spindles. So these kind of reddish cylinders are kind of the regular muscle fibers or regular muscle cells. And then this little miniature enclosed group of muscle fibers is the muscle spindle. So here you have a normal motor neuron that is contacting the normal muscle cells. And when you have action potentials coming along this motor neuron, it's going to make these cells contract. It's called an alpha motor neuron. The regular motor neurons are alpha motor neurons, and they're used to actually make muscle cells contract. But here you also have a gamma motor neuron, which is going into the muscle spindle and contacting the specialized muscle cells that are inside of the spindle. So it's actually going to be causing them to contract as well, but kind of in a different way. The gamma motor neuron is actually just matching the level of contraction in the overall muscle. So the alpha motor neurons are the ones that are making the muscle contract. And then based on how much the muscle contracts, the gamma motor neuron is going to contract the muscle spindle cells the same amount. Then you also have some other neurons entering the muscle spindle, and some of them have their processes kind of wrapped around these specialized muscle cells. So these are actual sensory neurons. When this muscle cell contracts, that is going to change the level of stretch that you have on this nerve ending that's wrapped around the muscle cell, and based on that change, you're going to get action potentials traveling back into the brain to sense actually the amount of tension in the muscle. Proprioception is a sense that you normally don't really think about. You probably didn't hear the word proprioception before this class. And of course, we're all kind of aware that we can sense the amount of tension in our muscles, but we don't consider that as one of our 5 senses. But it actually is a sense, and it's actually a really important sense. The main reason why it's so important is because you need it in order to be coordinated. So your cerebellum is trying to coordinate all your movements so that you actually do what you tried to do. In order to do that, it needs some information. So it's going to get information from your vestibular system so that it knows your balance, but it's also going to be getting information from your proprioceptive system. So it's going to be aware of the position of your joints and the amount of tension in your muscles. And it's going to use that information in comparison to information about your intended action to figure out like what you actually did compared to what your intended action was and how you could alter your actual action to better match your intended action. So if you don't have proprioception working properly, you will not have proper motor coordination. And we'll finish this section by just talking about the pathway that somatic sensory information takes as it travels into the brain. So it starts with your regular sensory neurons, which in this case are called first order sensory neurons because they're the first neuron in kind of the chain of neurons that's going to be relaying this information back into the brain. The first order sensory neurons are actually true sensory neurons because they are picking up information, they're picking up sensory stimuli on one end, and then on the other end they are sending that information to some other neuron. The cell body for your first order sensory neurons is going to be located in the peripheral nervous system in the posterior root ganglion. So this first order sensory neuron is the one that is actually responding to sensory information. It's the one that's actually doing sensory transduction to convert sensory stimuli into membrane potential changes. Then it's going to have action potentials traveling along it, and its axon is ultimately going to enter the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, its axon will synapse onto the next neuron in the chain, which is a second order sensory neuron. The second order sensory neuron has its cell body located in the spinal cord gray matter, and technically speaking, it's not a sensory neuron, it's an interneuron. It's an interneuron because it's connected to other neurons on both sides. So it's receiving information from a neuron and it sends information to a neuron. We call it the second order sensory neuron because the only neuron that it receives information from is the first order sensory neuron, so it's just sensory information, nothing else. So the first order sensory neuron is going to excite and cause action potentials to occur in the second order sensory neuron. The axon for the second order sensory neuron is going to travel up the spinal cord and into the brain, and it's actually going to go to the thalamus and synapse there onto a third order sensory neuron. The third order sensory neuron is also an interneuron because it's connected to other neurons on both sides, but again, it's only responding to sensory information, so we call it a sensory neuron even though it's not really a sensory neuron. The third order sensory neuron has its cell body in the thalamus, it receives information from the second order sensory neuron, and it's going to send its axon into the cortex. What part of the cortex it goes to is going to depend on what type of sensory information this is, and what part of the body the information is ultimately coming from. And then the only details to add here is that your second order sensory neuron can also have branches in its axon. So it can have axon collaterals that are not just going up into the thalamus, but would be going to a different part of the brain. For instance, maybe to the cerebellum to help motor coordination, or sometimes actually to a different part of the spinal cord for a reflex. Once the information gets up to the cortex, it'll be the third order sensory neuron that takes it up to the cortex. At that point, you will become consciously aware of the information. Or, actually technically sometime a little after that, it'll undergo some processing in the cortex and then you become aware of it. So this is kind of a visual representation of that pathway. So we start with a first order sensory neuron. The cell body for that neuron is found in the posterior root ganglion. Then its axon will travel down the spinal nerve to its ultimate location on some part of your body, maybe somewhere on the skin. where it gets to its location, its axon will branch, and you'll have your sensory receptors there. And you're going to have some type of ion channel there that is able to perform sensory transduction. So in this case, these are mechanically gated ion channels. So you have a sensory stimulus pressing down, just some object pressing down onto the skin and deforming this membrane to open these mechanically gated channels. Then you get a receptor potential that triggers these voltage gated sodium channels to open. Then you have an action potential. So this is sensory transduction occurring. Once you have your action potentials, they're going to travel up the axon and into the spinal cord. So your first order sensory neuron is going to have its axon enter the spinal cord and synapse onto the second order sensory neuron. The second order sensory neuron has its cell body located in the gray matter of the spinal cord, and its axon is actually going to cross to the other side of the spinal cord and then travel up to the brain. In the brain, it's going to go to the thalamus. You also might have some axon collaterals that are going other places, like maybe to the cerebellum. So there could be a branch here headed to the cerebellum or maybe somewhere else, but you're definitely going to have the axon entering the thalamus. There, it's going to synapse onto a third order sensory neuron, whose cell body is in the thalamus, and the axon of that third order sensory neuron is going to travel to the appropriate region of the cortex. So that's the path taken by somatic sensory information. But you also have some visceral sensory information coming in the sensory division. And that's going to follow a path that's very similar to the somatic sensory information, but just slightly different. So the first neuron in the pathway, again, is your first order sensory neuron. But to be more specific, you could call it a first order visceral sensory neuron or viscerosensory neuron, to denote that is picking up information from some visceral organ. And it belongs to the visceral sensory division. So this again is your true sensory neuron that is actually doing sensory transduction and responding to sensory stimuli, then sending that information to another neuron. This first order visceral sensory neuron will also have its cell body in the posterior root ganglion within the peripheral nervous system. Its axon is going to travel into the spinal cord and synapse on to a second order sensory neuron. The second order sensory neuron, again, is technically an interneuron, not a true sensory neuron. Its cell body is located in the spinal cord gray matter, and it's going to send its axon up through the spinal cord to the brain. Sometimes the second order sensory neuron is going to go to the brainstem and synapse there. Sometimes it may go to the actual thalamus. If it goes to the thalamus, then it's going to synapse onto a third order sensory neuron. So technically, the second order sensory neuron could be a visceral sensory neuron, or it could be a somatic sensory neuron. If it's a visceral sensory neuron, then it's going to be going to the brainstem. And you're not going to become consciously aware of the information that it's carrying. That information will just be processed there in the brainstem and responded to by the brainstem. But if it's a second order somatic sensory neuron, then that's when it's going to go to the thalamus and synapse onto a third order sensory neuron. The third order sensory neuron would have its cell body in the thalamus and then would travel, it would send its axon to the appropriate region of the cortex, which in this case would be the insula most likely. So if you have a second order visceral sensory neuron that is receiving information from the first order neuron and then traveling to the brainstem, there's different parts of the brainstem that it could go to, but a lot of these neurons are actually going to send their axon to a root of the vagus nerve, which is called the nucleus of the solitary tract. The nucleus of the solitary tract is kind of where the vagus nerve is receiving sensory information, and that's where that information would be used to respond. So the brainstem is going to kind of coordinate some type of response with the autonomic nervous system based on this information. If you instead had a second order somatic sensory neuron that is actually traveling to the thalamus, that is going to be causing you to perceive that visceral sensory information kind of inaccurately. It's going to cause you to perceive some sensation that is coming from a body part that it's not actually coming from. And that's called referred pain, if the sensation is pain. So you probably might have heard that when you're having a heart attack, you might not feel it in your heart. Instead, you might have pain like somewhere else in your chest or maybe in your arm, something like that. You might even be nauseous instead. So if you're having pain in your heart, but it feels like it's coming from your arm, that is referred pain. The pain is actually in your heart, but you think it's in the arm. You feel it like it's in the arm. The reason why you would feel it like it's in the arm is because you have a first-order visceral sensory neuron that is taking information from the heart, but it's actually sending it to a second-order somatic sensory neuron that's normally receiving information, somatic information from the arm. And that's kind of shown by this diagram here. So here we have a first-order somatic sensory neuron that is picking up information from the skin somewhere in your arm. And here we have a first-order visceral sensory neuron that's picking up information from the heart. Both of these neurons are traveling into, or sending their axons into the spinal cord. And you notice they both synapse onto the same cell body here in the spinal cord, which is a second-order somatic sensory neuron. So normally you would have maybe some pressure here on your skin, on your arm, that's going to be picked up by this first-order somatic sensory neuron. That information is going to be carried into the spinal cord and sent to the second-order somatic sensory neuron that's going to take it up into the brain to the thalamus and send it to the third-order somatic sensory neuron and send it to the cortex where you become aware of it. But in this case, you actually have pain coming from the heart, and that information is also going to the same second-order somatic sensory neuron, which is going to take it to the thalamus and send it to the third-order somatic sensory neuron, which is going to take it to the cortex, and you'll become aware of it. But you're going to become aware of it like it's coming from the skin, because normally that's how this pathway works. So your brain is interpreting this information as coming from the skin, which is the normal, the normal path. The brain doesn't really understand that the information is actually coming from the heart because it's being fed into the wrong pathway. It's being fed into a somatic sensory pathway, not a visceral sensory pathway. So the brain doesn't understand that it's not somatic sensory information coming from this part of the skin. So we will finish up this chapter by talking about the motor side of the peripheral nervous system, and specifically just the somatic motor part, because the autonomic or the visceral part has its own chapter. But also we're not going to talk about too many details of the somatic motor part because the muscles have their own chapter, so we won't worry about how the muscles are actually contracting. So basically we'll be focusing on kind of the organization of the somatic motor system and kind of that pathway, that motor information or somatic motor information is taking from the brain to your skeletal muscles. And it's actually kind of a complicated path. So you're going to start out with making a plan to conduct a certain action which will occur in the premotor cortex. Once you've got that plan made, that information is sent to the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia, if they're working correctly, will let the information through, and then the information will go to the thalamus, and then it gets relayed back to the motor cortex, to the primary motor cortex, not the premotor cortex. Once it gets to the motor cortex, so at that point you already have your plan made of what to do, and it's been allowed through the basal ganglia, so it's been gated. At that point, the plan is going to be kind of sent to an upper motor neuron. The upper motor neuron is called a motor neuron, but again, it's not a real motor neuron, it's an interneuron. It's an interneuron because it receives information from a neuron and it sends information to another neuron. A true motor neuron is going to receive information from a neuron, but send it to a muscle or a gland. So it'll activate a muscle to contract or activate a gland to secrete some substance. So the upper motor neuron is not really a motor neuron, it's actually an interneuron. But we call it a motor neuron because it only sends information to an actual motor neuron. So the upper motor neuron has its cell body located in the motor cortex, and its axon is going to descend through the brain into the spinal cord. And it actually will go all the way down the spinal cord to the appropriate segment. And there it's going to synapse onto a lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron is actually a true motor neuron because it's receiving information from a neuron and sending it to a muscle. In this case, because it's somatic motor information, it's sending it to a skeletal muscle. So the axon for this lower motor neuron is going to leave the spinal cord, travel along the anterior root, which is for motor information, and then it'll go down either the posterior or anterior ramus, and it'll end up contacting a skeletal muscle and activating that muscle to contract. So you also have like a special name for the synapse between that lower motor neuron and the skeletal muscle that it contacts. It's not like a proper synapse. They actually call it a neuromuscular junction because it's kind of the place where the neural system or the nervous system meets the muscular system. Then for your upper motor neuron, as that is traveling down through the brain, it's actually going to have its axon branch. And an axon collateral will go to the cerebellum so that the cerebellum knows what your motor plan was. At the same time, your cerebellum is also receiving proprioceptive information and vestibular information about, just the position of your body in space and what your muscles are actually doing. So then the cerebellum is going to send a signal back up to the motor cortex that can actually modify the activity of the upper motor neurons so that you will actually get done what you wanted to get done. So this is kind of a diagram summarizing that. You start with a neuron which is in the premotor cortex. So in the premotor cortex is where you're doing kind of motor planning. You're planning out your movements there. Once you have planned out your movements, that premotor cortex neuron will send its information or send its axon down to the basal nuclei. The information is going to kind of ping pong around in the basal nuclei, and we're not going to worry about the details of how the basal nuclei structures are connected to each other. They're all shown in green here. So we'll just say the information goes to the basal nuclei and they gate it and let it go through, and so then it comes back out. It's actually going to get sent to the thalamus. And from the thalamus, the information is going to be carried by another neuron back up to the cortex, but this time instead of going to the premotor cortex, it goes to the motor cortex. In the motor cortex, you have an upper motor neuron that is now going to be activated, and it's going to send its axon down through the brain into the spinal cord. At the appropriate level of the spinal cord, it's going to synapse onto a lower motor neuron, which is then going to send its axon out along the anterior root of the spinal nerve and ultimately go to a skeletal muscle and have a synapse with that muscle, which is called the neuromuscular junction. As this upper motor neuron's axon is traveling down through the brain, it's actually going to send off a collateral that will go to the cerebellum, which is actually not, that collateral is not drawn here, but it exists. And then the cerebellum is going to use that information along with sensory information to decide how to modify this action so it can be what you wanted it to be. And then the cerebellum is going to send that information up to the motor cortex as well, and it can modify the future activity of this upper motor neuron. There's two basic types of lower motor neurons. Most of them are alpha motor neurons, which are kind of the regular motor neurons that actually synapse onto a skeletal muscle and make it contract. But then some lower motor neurons are actually classed as gamma motor neurons, which are the type that we mentioned before in connection with muscle spindles. So the gamma motor neurons are actually just kind of mimicking the contraction in the overall muscle so that the muscle spindle will contract as much as the overall muscle does. Then the muscle spindle is going to send information about the level of contraction in that muscle, back into the brain. Ultimately, it'll be going back to the cerebellum. These muscle spindles actually end up being pretty important for motor coordination. In muscles where you don't have a lot of spindles, that's going to be a less coordinated muscle. If you have a muscle with a bunch of muscle spindles, that's going to be a highly coordinated muscle. So probably the muscles in your body that have maybe the most muscle spindles would be the ones in your fingers, or the ones that control your fingers. Then maybe the ones that are controlling your eyes as well would have quite a lot. But the muscles that control like your posture, so like your back muscles, those don't have a lot of muscle spindles. They don't need a lot of coordination. The last kind of motor-related thing we'll talk about in this chapter are your somatic reflexes. A somatic reflex is a reflex that you are consciously aware of, but you're not, actually doing it because it's a reflex. So there's also visceral reflexes, which are reflexes that you're not aware of at all. So for instance, like if you were to stand up, then that's going to kind of change the way that blood is flowing in your body, and your blood pressure is going to end up dropping. And you need your heart rate to increase so that you can have a steady blood pressure as you're standing up. So that's a visceral reflex. You're not aware of any part of that at all. With the somatic reflexes, that's more like touching something hot and yanking your hand back. Like you know that it happens, like you're aware of it while it's happening, but you're not actually controlling it. So four kind of basic types of somatic reflexes are, listed here. First, you have the simple stretch reflex. This is going to occur anytime a muscle gets stretched. When you stretch a muscle out, it's going to contract. The purpose of this reflex is to help you maintain muscle tone as you're doing a movement. So that's actually illustrated in this diagram over here. So imagine that you're holding an empty cup. And your muscles are going to be contracted with a certain level of force to keep that cup up, but of course they're not going to be like contracted as forcefully as they can be. You don't need to use that much strength to hold up a cup. Then if somebody pours some lemonade into your cup, you're going to have extra force now pushing down on this arm. You're going to be trying to support a greater weight now. So your muscles are going to end up getting stretched as your arm drops due to the new weight in the cup. So you're going to have muscle spindles that are actually activating now in response to this change in the length of your muscle. That information is going to go into the spinal cord along a first order somatic sensory neuron, and it's going to synapse onto an interneuron in the spinal cord. That interneuron is actually going to send the information to a motor neuron in the spinal cord, a lower motor neuron, which is going to go back out to the muscle and contract the muscle more so that your arm returns to its initial position. So you're basically just using this reflex to kind of keep yourself steady as you're doing movements that involve changes in the length of your muscles. The most common reflex that people are familiar with from the doctor's office is the knee jerk reflex, where the doctor hits your knee with a little hammer, and then your leg's supposed to kick out. That's actually activating a simple stretch reflex. So when you hit the knee, you're actually putting pressure on a tendon there, and that's going to end up stretching the muscle that tendon is attached to, and the muscle will contract in response, causing you to jerk your leg out. Another type of basic reflex is the flexion reflex. It's also called the withdrawal reflex. And this is the one where you touch something hot and you yank your hand away. So this is going to happen anytime that you have nociceptors or pain receptors activated in your skin. You're just going to contract the muscles that you would need to contract to remove your limb from that stimulus. You also have a crossed extension reflex that will occur anytime you have a flexion reflex occurring. In the crossed extension reflex, you're extending the opposite, or the same part of your body on the opposite side, or a body part, maybe I should say, on the opposite side of your body. So if you yank your hand back in the flexion reflex, in the crossed extension reflex, you're going to extend maybe a hand, or maybe you're going to extend your foot out backwards. Again, it'll be the opposite hand or the opposite foot. The reason why you're doing that is just so you can extend your so you can maintain your balance. Then finally, the last basic somatic reflex is a Golgi tendon reflex. So this is going to happen anytime a muscle becomes too contracted, and in response, it'll just relax. So this is based on activity in the Golgi tendon organs. If your muscle is very, very contracted, then you're going to have a large amount of stress on your tendons for that muscle. The Golgi tendon organs will sense that there is too much stress on those tendons, and they will cause your muscles to relax. And the point of it is just so you can avoid damaging your tendons, basically.